want to welcome all of you here today. My name is Bart Loser, and some of you may know I've been in Toastmasters as a leader for almost a dozen years here in this district, and I've been thrilled to be always doing what I can to help others in the district. And I started a program several years ago that is a continuing education program because I'm a fierce believer in constantly learning and finding opportunities for people to learn in many unique ways. And there are lots of ways to learn, but these classes is one way we can do so, and having an opportunity to participate live. And today we have a new member to our district, but certainly not a new Toastmaster, Mr. Chuck Hinckle. He's our speaker today. And Chuck recently retired from Shell Oil after nearly 40 years. He's trained more than 3,500 people in presentation techniques, including TEDx speakers, and was Shell's preferred North American presentations. I just let someone in the room here. North American presentations coach for executives and staff. He joined Toastmasters in 1982 and has founded 5 Toastmaster clubs, been the president of 2 others, and was District 56's first Distinguished Division Governor. Please help me welcome Mr. Chuck Hinckle, ATM. Chuck.
Thank you, Bart. I've got a question for you all. Actually, Bart's been asking it, which is, why are you here tonight? I mean, what's so hard about making slides, especially for data visualization? We all know how to use PowerPoint, right? No? We put our data into Excel and we tell it to plot, and then we paste it into PowerPoint. And then I have an impressive and persuasive slide, something like this. Maybe not. Although it is a fun slide. I think it's a fun slide. So I've been creating presentation slides and specializing in data visualization since the early 90s. Tonight, let me guide you past the roadblocks on the road from destructive slides to slide mastery. My plan is going to be to talk about how to avoid making terrible slides. Then I want to review concepts on how to make exceptional slides. And then at the very end, talk a little about data visualization, how to tell your story with graphs and make them persuasive. To begin with, if you're doing a professional presentation, maybe you're wondering, what are the minimum standards for your slides? So let's review those minimum standards. How do I make basic slides? And the number one thing that people hate in presentations is when a speech is completely written out on the slide. People can read faster than you can talk. So then they get impatient, they get upset. Some other key concepts is we would like to put one topic per slide. And maybe you've heard of the 5x5 rule, which is no more than 5 words per line, no more than 5 lines. Of course, I've also heard of the 6x6 rule, and I've heard of the 7x7 rule. There's not much consensus on that. Edward Tufte, who's a data visualization professor, he invented the haiku rule, which I kind of like. That's no more than 17 syllables per slide. But one thing that everybody agrees on, no matter how many lines they propose, is they want to treat bullets as if they're a headline. Another thing that's a basic technique in your slides is to use color to influence your mood, or you can use color to draw attention to a specific part of the graph that you want to talk about, or a part of the slide that you want to talk about. But your color should have meaning and not just be there for color. I went to a presentation and one of the slides showed a bubble plot, and I was there at the front row and really trying hard to figure out what the different colors represented, and I felt foolish. I finally had to ask the speaker, what do the different colors mean? And then he kind of looked down sheepishly and said, nothing, I just wanted to have some color. If you use color, though, you need to be careful about using choosing the colors you use. Specifically, in our case, red has lots of negative cultural connotations in America. It often represents death, anger. If you're doing accounting, it represents a deficit. I also say we want to avoid using a slide topic as a title. A topic is just a description of what's on the slide. What we'd like to do is replace it with a slide message. One of the first things, well, usually the first thing that people look at when a slide comes up, if it's a chart or a graph, is they'll look at the title. Go ahead and tell them in the title what the conclusion is. That way they can look at that and they can keep listening to you. They don't have to spend as much time deciphering the graph, and they'll look at the graph and say, oh yeah, I see that. So we like to use slide messages for our titles. Next thing to avoid, overexposed backgrounds. I just did a random search on Google. I said PowerPoint slides, and this is one of the first ones that came up. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine watching an entire presentation with this as the background? I would have to leave. Another thing for basic slides, avoid gratuitous animation. This is another one of those things listed as one of the most hated features in presentations. If you use animation, use it to make a point. Don't use it as a gimmick to keep your audience awake. I went to a Microsoft conference many, many years ago, and the presenter was doing a technical presentation, and he decided to be clever. He had on each slide, the letters appear one at a time, but it got worse. Accompanying each letter as it appeared was the typewriter sound. So it's going click, click, clack, clack, clack. And after the second slide, and I was sitting at the back of the room, I could see the audience. They were just screaming out the exits. And I felt so sorry for the guy, because by now it's too late for him to do anything about it. This is what he was stuck with for the entire presentation. And I left also. I couldn't take it. Do not use pixelated images. When I see an image that's all pixelated, it tells me a couple things. It tells me someone went to a website, just a random website. They did a copy of some image they liked and then pasted it and didn't even check to see what it would look like when they blew it up and showed it at a larger format. And it also tells me that person probably doesn't have a license or the authority to use that graph. So images do have copyrights, and make sure when you get your image to use that you have permission to use that license, to use that image. This is a newer technique that I'll complain about. Do not squeeze too many pictures on your slides. And I'll talk more about photos, a lot more about photos later. But I see this lately, and I wonder if there are bosses out there who are giving arbitrary limits and telling their directs, you can have so many slides. Don't you dare go past that number of slides. I look at something like this, and when I've seen these in presentations, the person will discuss each photograph in clockwise order usually. And really each one of these deserves its own slide. So instead of trying to squeeze all these photos into the same slide, and it may have been hard enough to read anyway, now you've got 6 of them on a slide, really, really tiny. So this is not a good practice. Each of these needs its own slide. And those are the precepts for basic slides. And you might wonder, why should I do more than a basic slide? You will get the idea after I'm finished speaking that it takes more work to make exceptional slides. And I've got another question for you. Is your goal to be effective or efficient? You increase your audience's probability of remembering and acting if you put more preparation into your presentation. How much preparation? Okay, how important is your topic and how important is your audience? If I'm doing a weekly 5-minute presentation to my team of 3 people on what I accomplished last week and what I'm going to do this coming week, I may put a few lines on a PowerPoint slide and that's good enough. But I can tell you, I remember a few years ago, the president of Shell Oil, Marvin Odom, got called to speak in front of Congress, along with the presidents of Exxon and Chevron, and I forget if there were any others. They had to defend what was going on. This is the beginning of the Great Recession, and they were explaining what was going on with pricing and availability. And I will bet you he spent more than an hour doing his preparation. I'll bet you he spent a week. In other words, I can decide to spend like 10 hours preparing to give you a very memorable presentation. Or if I'm speaking to, let's say, 100 people, I can waste 1 hour of 100 people's time. How important and how is the topic? How important is the audience? But what do I mean exceptional? I want you to consider Al Gore. This man is a very dull speaker. I'm sorry if you're an Al Gore fan, but it doesn't make him an exciting speaker. Yet he turned his book into a presentation. He used Keynote. He made it into a movie. That movie won an Academy Award, and he won a Nobel Prize. I've got to question whether in an alternative universe, would he have been as effective and won all of those awards if he had used standard PowerPoint techniques? Maybe not. So I want to look at how to move from not terrible to exceptional slides. First thing we're going to do is no bullet points. I don't care if it's a 5x5 or a 7x7 rule. I like the no rule, the no bullets. I'll ask you later whether you miss having bullet point slides. The problem with bullet points is when text appears on a screen, people have a choice. They can either stop listening to you and read, or they can keep listening to you and ignore the slide. They really can't do both. I'm going to challenge you when you make slides with photographs, find photographs to help tell your story. This way you're communicating on two channels, visually and auditorily. You want your slides, your photographs to be complementary. They should be vivid. You want something that'll be memorable. In other words, here's my point. I can talk about Hurricane Ike's destruction with a bunch of text, or I can show it. It's really fun to give this to a large group, large audience when you've got a giant screen behind you, because when this picture comes up, I can see the people in front of me. They kind of lean back, you can see them shudder because it's such a graphic image. It has such power. How did you feel when this slide comes up? Your images will help your audience understand your point better, and you will make more of an emotional connection with your audience with the slides that you use, the images that you use. Here's something I see with lots of slides. I see text on the slide, and then there's a little photograph to enhance it. What I'm going to encourage you to do, integrate the text into the photo, merge them. Now you have a photo that's part of the image and they belong together. You can also use this technique, or a technique like this, like placing a white background behind the text to help it pop out from the photo. Sometimes I've got busy photos and I don't have a nice blank spot where I can put text. I can still put a text box behind it and make it a neutral color. And now the text becomes easier to read. I'll give you another example. Here's a message from Burger King. They did a survey. Survey shows people prefer the Whopper. But look how much stronger this message is with a slightly different picture. You're going to remember that one. So talking about photos, no tacky clip art. This is if you were in Shell, you would know that this is a typical Shell presentation because this is the Shell diversity iceberg. I say, I don't like this. Replace this with something that'll stick. This is the photo I use for when I talk about the diversity iceberg. And then I'll use a bit of animation to make the point that there are invisible values below the waterline. I'm going to pause here. I think we have a moment to discuss or take any questions about basic and starting to make exceptional slides, if there are any questions that you all have.
I had one in terms of wanting to put a lot of information, but you don't want to show too many slides, perhaps, that you might talk about something first and just have that show up on the slide, and then perhaps have it disappear and something else then show up on the slide. You can talk about that. That might be an interesting way to animate a slide a bit more, because I was saying earlier how I've done some presentations of my travels, and you want to put a lot of pictures in there, but after a while, people aren't as excited about your pictures as you are. So perhaps, so I've learned how to just essentially just decide I can only have a few of my favorites and just have to cut out a lot of the major slides, because it's just too much for people, especially in a 5 to 7 minute speech.
That can be true. Maybe you'll notice even more as we go along. I tend to go through lots of slides. I try not to let managers see how many slides I have before the presentation. They'll say, you can't get through that many slides in 45 minutes. And then we're done. And they say, you were right spot on. It worked perfectly. But part of it, and I will say, I've also found that on online presentations, I think there's even more value to changing slides more frequently, because you know that the bane of online meetings is people are off doing email and not concentrating on the screen. But when I have done these presentations, people have told me they have to keep watching because I go through lots of slides. So that was an unintended benefit of using lots of photos to complement what I'm talking about. So I do switch through slides fairly rapidly.
I think for us as Toastmasters, that's probably one of the best pieces of information I've heard so far, because when you're in these meetings, they do get boring when you just see heads and such. And if someone's doing a graphic presentation, if you don't have a lot of graphics, their attention will be drawn elsewhere, checking emails, like you said, other things, so you can keep their attention. And that's a great way to keep the attention. So I like that idea. Thanks.
All right, we're going to keep going. So Gar Reynolds wrote a book called Presentation Zen. He documented several principles in creating exceptional slides, and I want to review some of his principles today with you, because that's what I've learned to use in my presentations. The first one is called signal to noise ratio. Basically, it's hard enough to understand your message. Don't make it harder by surrounding it with non-essential components on your slides. You degrade your message if you select inappropriate charts or use ambiguous labels and icons and emphasize items like lines and shapes and symbols and logos. If you can remove something from the slide without compromising the visual message, then minimize it or get rid of it. We also want to avoid 3D graphs. They're hard to read. Can you really tell which slice here is 2%? And I say, you don't need a logo on every slide. Real estate on your slide is very valuable. Don't give it away to the logo. I'll usually put a logo on the first slide, and then I'll put it at the very last slide to remind people in case they've forgotten what company I'm with. It just doesn't happen. You don't need the logo on every slide. Here's a slightly better version. I've converted the pie chart to a bar chart to make it easier to interpret. I've removed the logo. I've removed those extra lines. But even here, the colored lines don't mean anything, so they're still just noise. And this would be the best version. The bar that I want to focus on and that I'm doing the presentation on stands out, and there's no doubt what I'm going to talk about. Here's an example where the clip art on this slide is pointless, so why include it? And what's the deal with having a beige background, a white background, and a black background? You don't need 3 different colors competing for attention. If you want to make the point that the US is 10 times the rate of Japan, you also don't need to list every country in between. You can simplify your chart like that. And if you really do want to provide that detail for people to review, you can have that as a handout to give to people later, or give them a link to a site where that chart would be. Here we have another case of a bad title and another case of using 3D. I'll tell you, if you want to mislead people, 3D charts are the way to do it. Because without the labels, I would have thought that that third item is like 25%. Here we have a version a lot clearer and a lot easier to understand. And you'll say, wait, you've got a photograph on your slide. What does that do to your signal to noise? It's reasonable to consider elements that support the message at a more emotional level. It contradicts SNR, signal to noise ratio, but emotional elements often matter. Sometimes they matter a lot. Your guiding principle should be clarity. In the end, signal to noise is just one principle among many that you should consider when creating a visual message. In this graph, I decided to use the image because it supplements the graph's message. It doesn't get in the way of the chart. Next technique is called empty space, also known as negative space or white space. When we're designing slides, we have to overcome our urge to fill all that empty area with more elements. But empty space implies elegance and clarity. When you're in a high-end store, it creates feelings of high quality and sophistication and importance. That empty space on your slide in a design isn't nothing. It's very powerful and gives the few elements on the slide their power. The more that we add, the more that we dilute the slide and the less effective the contents become. How often have you been in a presentation, you get a slide like this, and the presenter, you know what he's going to say? I'm sorry for this busy slide. Here, let me talk you through it. That's code message to me. It tells me you didn't prepare for this presentation. You don't care about your audience. To me, this looks like about 6 or 7 slides, not one slide that you threw up at me. Now, I've had slides where a boss saw white space and asked to add more text, but let the white space draw attention to the items that you have on the chart. You don't need to add more items. Your goal is to make it easy on the audience. Simplify your slides to help them so that they aren't distracted. I coach speakers to put 1 item per slide or to only introduce 1 new item per slide. Here's an example of a presentation I gave. I used a series of slides to build up to the final graph. On each slide, I discussed the item that I had added to the picture. Do you see how much harder it would have been to start with this slide? Your job is to make it easy for the audience to get your point. Sometimes I've had to present technical slides and you can't just put 1 piece of information on the slide and you can't build it like I just did. In cases like that, you can do all kinds of techniques. One technique is to use callouts. You've seen callouts like on maps. It can direct your attention to the specific part that you want to talk about next. I say you should never need a laser pointer when you're doing a presentation. Well, maybe if you're answering questions and they don't even work on screens, on some screens, the ones that are television monitors, because they're projecting their own light and your laser will get lost in it. What I'll do in some of these cases is I like to dim the parts of the graphs I'm not talking about. I'm directing attention to the part of a complicated graph. And then each slide emphasizes a different portion of the graph. Or instead of masks, I may use what I call a virtual laser pointer. The key is you know what needs focus before you give the presentation. When you're building your slides, you know what order you're going to talk about and what part of the slide you're talking about next. So this is really 3 copies of the same slide, and I'm putting my circle on the area that I'm talking about next. It makes it easier for your audience to follow you and makes the slides complement what you're talking about. Next technique is balance. It's used to influence the mood that a slide projects. So you've got symmetrical designs where the empty space is passive and often pushed to the sides. Symmetry evokes feelings of formality, stability. Asymmetry introduces motion and energy, and it makes your designs more interesting to look at. Similar is alignment and proximity. So that's the intelligent use of empty space. A well-aligned design has a clear unified message. It has a clear starting point, and the slide kind of guides the viewer through the design without them having to wonder, where should I be looking next? The point of the alignment principle is nothing in your slide should look like it was just randomly placed on the slide. Alignment is about achieving unity among the elements on a single slide. Even elements on opposite sides of a slide have a visual connection. And if you don't use alignment, you end up with elements that are almost aligned, and the slides look a little less professional. Slides that contain aligned elements just look cleaner. The proximity principle then is about grouping related items to achieve a more organized look. Viewers assume that items that aren't near each other are not closely related. This slide has poor alignment and poor proximity. It seems to contain 5 different elements. This version uses symmetrical balance and better proximity. The related items are clearly together. The type size and the color give a greater contrast. This slide and the next one are going to show how aligning all of the elements flush right creates a strong invisible line that ties them together. It's more interesting than just a symmetrical title. And the type and color have been adjusted to create more contrast and interest. Then here's another variation of that one. Photographers have developed the rule of thirds for framing their shots. Subjects in the middle of a photograph make photos uninteresting, they find. But if you make a grid like a tic-tac-toe board, the 4 intersection points are called, get this, power points. Try to place your subject there rather than in the center of the slide. Here you've got the eyes and the word caffeine at a couple of the power points. And same here. Our brains are wired to notice differences. Contrast gives design its energy. You can get contrast by manipulating space, so have things near and far, empty and filled. Through color choices, so dark and light, cool and warm, by typeface, by positioning, top and bottom, isolated, grouped, things like that. Here's an example of a slide without enough contrast, whereas here's a slide with very high contrast. So contrast creates designs where one item is clearly dominant. It helps your viewer get the point of your design very quickly. Again, there's another similar example to what we've seen. Which bar graph is the most important one? You are not sure, but now is there any doubt? We want to be careful not to overdo contrast. This slide looks very busy because there's too much contrast between the background of the images and the slide background. Then on this slide, the images and text are aligned and the image backgrounds are made transparent by making the slide background white. So we end up with a slide that's cleaner and we've reduced the noise that was in the slide. Here's another one where there's too much contrast between the backgrounds. It's like this bird is trying to fly in this tiny little box in a small part of the slide. But when you make the image's blue background unnoticeable by making the rest of the slide with the same background, now we have a more harmonious visual. Here's a busy template that makes the useful area of the slide about 1/3 smaller than the slide really has. Whereas now the image covers the whole slide. The text is clearly in the foreground and the image serves as both background and foreground. We get a cleaner and a more dramatic look. Talk about repetition. Repetition means to reuse similar elements throughout the design. It gives a clear sense of unity and cohesiveness. So in this series, I did for a safety presentation, see how a similar red X and red text add consistency to the presentation. Our brains are also hardwired to recognize faces. We are extremely good at examining faces to analyze how people we meet are reacting to us. We have trained ourselves to pay attention to faces. We are so good at spotting faces, we even see them where they aren't. You probably are all too young, but these were the early photos from Mars. And there were newspaper stories at the time suggesting, look at these, this proves that there were ancient civilizations on Mars. Here are the buried ancient statues in the sand. And these are really just random rock formations, but we are looking for faces and we see them even though they aren't there. Graphic designers and marketers know all about this, and that's why they use faces in marketing communications. We naturally look in the direction that other people look. There's a thing called eye tracking software. It can show where people are looking at on a slide. What do they look at the most? They look at the people's faces. They also look at what people are looking at. Maybe you've seen the experiment where the researchers stop on the sidewalk, they all stare at the sky. Pretty soon everyone else is looking up there too. We can use eye gaze to help guide our audience's eyes. People looking at this image, they tell me they can feel their eyes being diverted off the page. If you want them to see the text, don't have the images looking the other direction. This version shows a fit between the image and the text. It's even true for photos of animals. The bird's beak is like a pointing finger. And here it isn't the face of the bird as much as its orientation. We can tell the bird is flying up towards the text. Okay, I've covered a lot on making slides, but before I talk about using slides to enhance stories, I want to talk first about the power of stories. Why stories? When we give a presentation, we want to be persuasive, right? Stories make data more memorable and become more motivational. One of our VPs say that a consultant told him that a study shows that wrapping a story around data made the audience 22 times more likely to remember the data. That is such a good fact. So I wanted to share with the speakers I coach, but I can't just tell them this without any context. I wanted to know where it came from, so I knew who to cite. And then I started thinking, I'm curious, how did they come up with an experiment that came up with this number? How'd they measure it? So I searched on Google for 22, story, and data. At first, I only found a few pages, and frustrating. First page cited the second page cited the third one cited the first one. But I kept searching until I found a site that had a name, Jerome Bruner. Bruner was a Harvard psychology professor who made significant contributions to cognitive learning theory. It was his study that determined the stories make data 22 times more memorable. I included Bruner's name in the search, and now I had dozens or hundreds of sites quoting his study. I spent an hour searching them, but I couldn't find any that described the experiment, and I was getting frustrated. I finally got lucky. I found a PDF that referenced a book of his in a footnote. I was so close. I didn't have access to the book, and I recruited my son. So he was at Texas A&M. He could access academic papers. He was able to see that book's contents. There was still nothing in it about the experiment. And now both of us were caught up in the search for another hour. We finally found an earlier document that said Bruner had proposed that a story makes the data 22 times more memorable. And now it all made sense. He was probably at a party. He told a colleague that he believed including a story makes the data 22 times more memorable. And the colleague told a friend, word got around, consultants started including that in their presentations. And then they started telling their clients that Bruner had proven this in a scientific study. And then just like everyone repeats that we're supposed to drink 6 to 8 glasses of water per day, this storytelling fact became another point of urban wisdom. And now that I've told you my story about researching this statement, you are 22 times more likely to remember this number. That's stories. But why do they work? I like to ask people when I do this presentation, whose favorite school subject was history? And generally about 20% of the crowd will raise their hand. Then I'll ask them, who likes the History Channel? And almost everybody raises their hand. What's the difference? Consider documentaries on the History Channel. They don't just give names and dates. That's what people didn't like in their history books. They give the story of the war. They describe a dramatic sea rescue or the obstacles that the inventor had to overcome. So in class, our conscious mind kept reminding us, go read the book. You're going to be tested on this. But our brain keeps telling us, this is dull. The brain cares about the story. Good stories illustrate a struggle. The biggest element that a story has is conflict. It's dramatic. If you tell a story about how you've struggled with your antagonists, the audience is engaged with you and your material. Our brains remember stories that have a strong emotional element to them. Back to Gore Reynolds. He had 4 students in his Japanese labor management class that did a presentation on employment security in Japan. 3 days later, when he asked other students to list the main points of the presentation, what they most remembered weren't the labor laws or the principles or the changes in the labor market in Japan. They remembered the section on karoshi, that's work-related suicide. Now, that was a minor point in the presentation, maybe 5 minutes out of an hour, but it's the thing that the audience remembered because the presenters were telling the story, emotional stories of real people. What's this have to do with slides? I'm talking about stories, slides. One of my theories when I would do this at Shell is the Shell hires smart people. Probably where you work, people get hired because they're smart. My theory is they're going to figure out your graph. If you put it on a slide, why make them work at it? And they're going to be distracted while they're trying to look at your slide and figure it out. So don't settle for the default Excel format. Cole Kneflick was the chief visualization officer at Google. This is her example. She showed this graph that shows the 7th grade fitness trends in California and what percentage of the students meet the physical fitness standards. This isn't a very good or persuasive slide yet. So what'd she do? She makes it better by choosing the right graph for time series. It's a line graph, and that's what we want to use in a graph like this. She also decluttered the graph. So that's the signal to noise ratio. She removed the excess lines. She made the axes easier to read. She took off the line for multiracial. It only has 2 data points. It didn't add to the story. Also, don't make readers jump back and forth from the graph to the legend. So we integrated them. We also made the labels colors match the lines. Talking about color though, at this point, color doesn't help the story yet. She converted to grayscale before we decide how to use color to decide what to emphasize. What I want you to notice is that the story that you decide to tell should drive the formatting for your graph. I'm going to show the same graph and I'm going to tell you different stories. The stories are all accurate, but the one that you decide that you're going to motivate and use in your presentation should then determine how you color the graph. Here's the first story. From 2002 to 2012, Pacific Islanders have seen practically no change. Or you could have the story, note the gap between the two groups. Or you can show the overall improvement over the last 10 years. Or you could emphasize the decline among all the groups since 2010. Or you can point out that among all the groups, less than half of 7th graders meet the fitness standards. Or you could really emphasize the gap to achieve 100% of 7th graders meeting the standards. What I want you to notice, all these stories are valid interpretations, but the one that you choose to be telling, because maybe you're looking for a program to be put into place, maybe you want to encourage one type of activity, you want to make sure that you have your graph tell the same story that you're describing. The graph that you use, the way you color it, depends on your story. You also need to know your audience. You wouldn't want to present the same stories to an informal group of colleagues as you would with a formal presentation. They're going to react differently. So you adjust your slides. I hate it when the speaker's up there and says, we're going to skip over these slides. They're not really relevant tonight. Again, coded message. To me, the speaker is saying, it would take me too long to explain these complex ideas to this audience, and I was too lazy to hide them last night. So remove the slides that you're not going to use. Remember that the bigger the chasm between the audience's background and your presentation, the more that you need ways to engage them. That means things like memorable stories, humor, passion. Your great science presenters are able to present very complex ideas so that even those with the least foundational knowledge still understand the purpose of the research and its relevance. And they appreciate that you're helping them understand those complex ideas. But on the other hand, if you're doing a scientific presentation to a bunch of other scientists, you're going to skip the humor and skip the stories. Scientists tend to expect other scientists to be dispassionate and objective, and they'll get turned off if your presentation is too engaging. So as I say, you have to adjust the presentation based on your audience and adjust the stories, adjust the slides. Here's my overall guidance for slides and for images. Keep the focus on your story and what's the main thing that you want your audience to remember. So use photos for about 10% of the presentation that are conclusions, and then use graphs for all of the details. As an example, I helped someone prepare for his town hall, and I like to ask my speakers, what's the one thing, if they only remember one thing, what do you want it to be? And he said he wanted them to remember that this project will be profitable at $50 a barrel oil. Now I have an intriguing hobby. After town hall messages, after the next day, I like to ask people what they remember from the town hall. And most of the time it's zero, it's very little. They remember going, they remember who they saw, and they don't remember much of the presentation itself. I was pretty impressed with it. This was the opening slide he had in his deck, his presentation. And at the next quarterly town hall, so a quarter later, everybody still remembered the topic from the previous town hall. And that's the power of a good image that combined with the story he told about the $50 a barrel oil. And we're ready for questions. So you can come off mute and ask your hardest questions.
Well, you addressed so much, I can't imagine there would be many questions other than I've got to go back through this again and take more notes.
That was exactly what I was thinking, but I was going to say, I don't have any questions, but I do need to go back through and I'm going to watch the video now. I did want to say, I found where you demonstrated this is a bad slide and these are better. I know that's a standard Toastmasters technique, but I actually found it really helpful. I wouldn't have imagined it because I couldn't conceive of it, but when I saw the difference, it really helped, especially that one towards the end where you showed the different stories that were possible from one graph.
Oh yeah,
that was super helpful. So thank you.
That's amazing, dude.
I've already got an idea of how to redo a speech I did last night. I thought, oh, it was way too many pictures and not enough stories and things like that. Now I know how to tell the stories with the pictures. And so I want to review this again and say, I'm going to give this next Monday and have this be a very different speech. But similar speech, but have a very different impact.
I used to do a presentation on cross-cultural negotiation. So best ways to accomplish that. And I called it stealth diversity because one of my theories, again, people don't want to come to diversity classes. They kind of feel it's a waste of time. A lot of the people I know thought of them that way. But if you give it a topic like cross-cultural communication, how can you negotiate better with people from other cultures? All of a sudden, people are willing to come because they're going to learn something. Oh, and I slide a whole bunch of diversity stuff between cultural stuff in there. And it was a typical bullet point presentation. I'd do it. If it was 90 minutes because there was an exercise in the middle and people would be very complimentary. They said they learned a lot. They liked the presentation. And then I read Gore Reynolds' book and I thought, should I really do it? Should I convert this to photographs? Oh, that's a leap of faith. So I changed it all up. I took out all the bullet points and now it's all photographs. And I did it the next time. And I still got the same types of compliments, but instead of just the, oh yeah, this was really helpful, this was really useful, I learned a lot, they were coming up and going, wow, this is the best presentation I've seen. And I like to say, I even have a groupie. I did a presentation, I did the same one the second time for another group, and I saw someone there who came to the first one. I said, what are you doing here? And she says, You did such a great job with this presentation. I wanted to see it again. So your visual format can make a big difference, even more than you can imagine.
Look, I think you make a great point about when we're giving a presentation, if you can make it entertaining to the eyes, that's where you really draw in your audience. And I think that's the big point that I've taken from this, is that I want to make my presentations more a story for the eyes. It doesn't, you don't have to tell the story, but the picture itself can be the story or can enhance the point you're making. And I would have to say I so rarely do that. So yeah, I'm probably like you, was tied to bullet points. I said, no, they have to remember these points. I was like, no.
They don't remember them.
Exactly.
They really don't.
Yeah, it's a good point.
They remember the $50 bill picture.
This is Deb. That's what I really liked, was that when you put a slide up, they didn't have to have words on it. Because I felt such a connection with the story and the photographs that I wasn't expecting.
And with a good presentation, you were there. You're the one, you're the main feature. You are presenting the words, and you are always going to be more persuasive than your slides. The slides have to be complementary to you and keep pushing the attention to you. It's kind of like they are directing attention back to you because you're controlling the photographs. They can see the photographs, but they're also hearing what you say. And the two together make it a more memorable point.
Chuck, I have a friend who, Deb here just asked the question too, we have a mutual friend who is a master at doing PowerPoint programs without PowerPoint. So he pretends it's up there and describes the slide in his speech in such a way where you see it in your mind. You can see exactly what the photograph must be. And I've never seen something that was so powerful like that. And I thought that was the most amazing technique. You have to be really good at telling a story and describing details.
That's what I'm saying. I'm sure he's telling stories.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And he shows a photograph that's not really there, but also while he's telling this story, he describes what this photograph is, what's the point of this photograph? It's just an amazing technique that's similar to what you're working with, which is tell the story with your photo or tell the story with your slide. Don't tell the details. Yeah. Good point.
This is why I say that an exceptional presentation is a lot more work, because a good slide deck makes terrible handouts. And good handouts make terrible slides. So if you're giving something for people to take away, to remember and learn from, and maybe refer to afterwards, you end up making two sets. That's why I say, how important is it? How effective do you want to be? Because at the most effective level, you're going to make two documents. I've heard the term slide you meant, I think, which is a sarcastic handout being used as a slide presentation. It's not necessarily effective.
I get asked a lot, can I have a copy of your PowerPoint? It's like, it's not going to have the same impact. So trying.
I tell them, I can share it with you. It won't mean anything.
Yeah. Good point there. So do you suggest for when there is an information heavy session that you're teaching, you want to make it entertaining and such, the presentation, and memorable, but if there's specific details you want them to walk away with, do you recommend a handout to go with that?
I'll do different things. Sometimes I will use some text. I will integrate it onto the slide, and especially if I'm doing something with graphs, because I may want to have text appear that point with arrows and pointing out certain features that I want them to notice.
Okay.
I have used handouts also. I tend to give handouts out after I'm done because I don't want people flipping through handouts while I'm presenting. That's always one of those difficult questions. When should I give the handout? But if you give it to them ahead of time, they can be better prepared. Not that 98% of the people ever look at your handouts ahead of time, I believe.
Well, and if you make those great slides and they're looking at the handout, that's not helping at all. Especially as much
And the
work as you must
handout-
put into it. Yeah.
So the purpose of a handout is to replace you when you weren't there. I expect the handout to have all the details and probably go into a lot more details than the actual presentation. Because during the presentation, if people have questions, you are there to answer the questions. If they aren't at the presentation and I'm giving them a handout so they can follow, they can catch up, I'm not there to answer the difficult questions or any of the questions that they have. So if it's not already covered in the handout, it gets unanswered. That means I need to put a lot of more information into that handout than I would even put into the presentation, knowing that I can add stuff on the fly at the presentation. If people look confused, I can add some more information at that moment.
Chuck, could I ask you a
Yes.
question, please? You cited 2 authors, and I got the name of one, Carl
Okay.
Reynolds.
Gar Reynolds, Garr, and his
Okay.
book is Presentation Zen. And the other was Cole Knaflic. Cole Nussbaumer.
wonder I
Yeah,
didn't
Nussbaumer
get it.
was the maiden name. She's Knaflic. She has a very good website called Storytelling with Data. That's also the name of the first book. What other books there? If we did the full thing on data visualization, I've got a whole bunch of other sources, but those two are Gar, especially talking about slide and building slides.
Uh-huh.
And Cole is especially into how to present your data visualizations so that it's meaningful and persuasive. And then I just try to put them together.
Well, there's just so much information in this speech. I couldn't even keep up taking notes, but it's just fantastic. And I really appreciate you doing this and that I got to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be so helpful.
And Joanne, just to let you know, we will be making this a copy of this presentation available in our resource library, so that
Oh,
you'll have
wonderful.
plenty of opportunities to
Yeah.
watch it over and over again until you've mastered it.
I'm
Right.
doing my slides mentally in my head from my trip and seeing where I went wrong already.
Well, I have to say, I've certainly learned at least 22 times more than I knew before I came to
yeah.
the session.
Yeah.
So I really do
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I just wanted to check before we leave, if there's any other questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. And Chuck, I just want to say, I really appreciate you taking your time and making this marvelous presentation. We have you coming back in December, I believe.
That's
It's
true.
so on the second Tuesday in December, we'll be doing a presentation on evaluations. And another wonderful presentation. I expect a fabulous slideshow along with that too.
All right.
So
So
we'll
as
hold you
promised,
to
as promised, I'm going to take a poll. Who would have preferred this entire presentation with all bullet points?
No.
And I can't see everybody. I guess I could see people's hands. But when I asked this question live, I would say at least 90% report that they prefer this more visual presentation.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
get to tell people at that point, look around the room. These are your colleagues. They're telling you what they want in a presentation. And I agree with them. To me, it makes presentations that I attend much easier for me to understand. And I'm going to do something you're not supposed to do in Toastmasters. I'm going to thank you for attending tonight because I know that you're going to give better presentations and you're going to inspire better presentations that I'm going to have to sit through someday. And I don't like sitting through boring presentations.
Well, on behalf of District 55 and certainly the continuing education program, Chuck, I want to thank you for joining our district. We're certainly blessed to have you here now in our District 55. And I will be putting this onto our libraries, into our library on the tmd55.org library. And thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Chuck. I look forward to your next presentation on evaluations. So it's a thrill to have you here.
You all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.